Got it. There we are.
Okay, we're all sitting comfortably.
I'm doing my best.
Then we shall begin. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Vic. How are you
Back on the
doing?
show. How are you, mate? How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. Yeah, the sun's out, so that's a nice thing.
In it?
Yeah,
It's not here.
Is it with you as well?
Afraid not. We had a
Oh.
little spell yesterday, so that was pleasant, I've got to say. But it's been a battering week from a weather perspective.
Well, it has been pretty rubbish here. So, I mean, it's today we've got some clear skies, and it's not warm, it's cold. That's nice.
Well, the fire's on, and I can't complain, really.
Well, exactly. That's right. Now, we may have some interference, as you said, from your side, and there might be some from mine. I've got people clankering around upstairs. So,
right.
I'm not sure clankering is a word, but it is now. I've just done the Shakespeare thing of creating my own word.
Wow,
so that's good.
Brilliant.
So, Paul, you were on the podcast a little while ago. We spoke about all sorts of creative stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't go down this sort of the magical rabbit hole.
Yeah.
It's what I wanted to do today.
Yes.
So, obviously, there's a lot of people who listen to this podcast who are practitioners within the magical field in various shape or form.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that a lot of artists are
in
one shape or form. Oh, they certainly, let's put it from the perspective that they think of sort of a magical realism. So where do you come into that? Because obviously you were involved in you're interested in sort of philosophy and stuff like that, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just sort of recap a bit.
Sure.
Because you sort of dropped in the conversation when we were talking that you'd done, I don't know how many degrees.
Just a couple. Nothing
was a few.
Yeah.
As you do.
Let me just get clear what your parameters are. We were talking about magic because I'm very interested in it, but we didn't get into the subject matter, and it really does speak to my ideas about consciousness and philosophy of consciousness. I think in ways that other areas of human activity don't. I think.
Yes.
Because it is intrinsically mysterious. There's a mystery. And what's interesting is, of course, that was just a couple of throwaway remarks. And connections, for example, to Rich, that are too complicated to really bother talking about. But what was really interesting is, following our conversation, I have, established more of a routine in that direction, in that sector of my life. And I don't think it's a coincidence. It is, but I think it was a natural thing to happen out the back of that conversation, that I should start thinking about more explicitly and engaging more with it. I think it really is about my willingness to say yes to that side of existence, really, at this point, and it is extremely interesting to me, both theoretically and from a life living perspective. So there you are. That's what's happened since, is I've been engaging more and more with that side of existence.
See, my interest in this is that if we look at it from a point of view of creativity, so much about creativity is unknowable. And not only that, it seems to work better if you have this way of thinking where you aren't going to know. And there is this enormous cosmos out there that you can interact with, which if you come at it from a logical perspective, you'll immediately blank that out. And it seems that, and I've watched a lot of people in this sort of creative modality, whether that's writing songs or just learning to play a musical instrument. The reason that children are so good at learning is that they don't have those sort of restrictions in thinking. They could still be Superman or Superwoman or whatever, you know, or super person, maybe I should say now. Everything is possible.
Correct, yes.
And there is this sort of idea of impossibility doesn't enter into the vocabulary or their thinking. And that is exactly what we need as sort of creative people. Now,
right.
You've got a lot of noises now. And I think the whole perspective of problem solving should be that. That the solution to a problem may lie in an area that is not knowable. You know, you could find the solution to it, but how you got there. And I think my first interaction with this. Can you actually hear this noise in the background?
I can't, but I'm not headphoning into this. I'm probably losing a lot of detail, thankfully.
Right. Well,
I can hear
something
vaguely interrupting, not interrupting you at this end, Vic.
Well, we'll see how we go. So my first interaction with this was the idea that, you know, if you went back into sort of even medieval periods, you could just have a revelation. You could just know the answer to something. And of course, as we sort of traveled down the Enlightenment sort of thing, it became more, well, you couldn't do that anymore because you'd have to back that up with evidence and all the rest of it before you could do this. But in reality, of course, most discoveries come from that sort of thing, where then they sort of reverse engineer something in order to come up with a solution of how they arrived at the answer.
Right.
But of course, for most people, it acts as a sort of a limitation to coming up with those ideas because you think that you can't think like that. That's the point.
Yes.
I'm not saying you shouldn't back things up with a logical reason. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is to arrive at an answer, you need not to inhibit it with this sort of the editor, you know. And I see that in creative thinking all of the time. You know, this is why I use things like cut up a lot.
Right.
Because you're not editing, you're just making a mess of things until you've got such a lot of stuff that you've got to then start to pare it down. And then the editor comes in and does the work and starts making full.
Yeah.
So that's my sort of take on it. And I don't know whether this matches anything for you. But as I've been going along, it's more and more evident to me that that is exactly how we should be functioning.
Right.
Because it seems to get around problems that we're set up by the way that we educate ourselves into thinking. Anyway.
Right.
What was your call?
I totally agree with all of that, Vic. And I resonate with it as well. Like it makes a deeper sense to me. I think it's instructive to begin with like some of the basics. I think a good basis for conversations to look at the foundations. Now, one of the foundational problems with the way we're operating, and arguments made by much more intelligent and scholarly people than me, are that really all you have is your experience. And I mean, this is, you know, that particular point of view is denigrated. You know, it's cordoned off into an area of philosophy, and it's labelled in a critical way, but it's still true. It doesn't stop it being true. That everything that you read and receive from culture, and that doesn't matter which culture, that could be scientific culture, literary culture, media culture, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're still in your experience. Your experience is primary. And the attempts to invalidate that, and when I say attempts, I mean, it's not necessarily a contrivance or a conspiracy. It runs against the heart of the idea, the ideal and idea of objectivity, that we can have an objectively observable universe. I'm in a very, very strange position because, well, I think I ought to be in a strange position, and therefore I'm in a strange position because that strange position is as follows. Even though I accept that the point I've just made, I also have to accept that if this was bleeding obvious, everybody would get it. There is a mystery here. Yeah. There's a mystery between the confluence of cultural understanding and personal experience, and how those two things flow together is an extraordinarily difficult thing to wrestle with for some reason. And we struggle with it. And if it was obvious, we wouldn't struggle with it. The obvious, wouldn't it? So it's not obvious. So what's my angle? Why am I so arrogant, perhaps, or might interpret me so arrogant as to propose that I might be able to come up with something by way of insight? Well, it's not arrogance, it's optimism. It's optimism. I'm deeply optimistic that some of the answers here are obvious. Even though there's still a mystery, I'm not trying to repudiate the idea of a mystery, but I am thinking that some of the answers are obvious. And we touched upon this last time when we spoke about Ian McGilchrist and my particular derivation of his ideas, which is more to do with language and logic. I don't know if you need me to recap that.
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah.
Okay, so so Ian McGilchrist's idea is that there are two hemispheres, and I'll just really pop this down as quickly as I can. Two hemispheres of the brain, which relate to attitudes of mind and attention. The left hemisphere is has its particular role, and its particular role is in separating objects from other objects. So in other words, it objectifies our universe for us. And the right hemisphere's role in attention is really to try and understand the context in which all of this is happening. And the difficulty is that the left hemisphere's view of the world is the one that is favored by culture.
Yes.
And so this unfortunately subordinates the right hemisphere's role. And from Ian McGilchrist's point of view, the right hemisphere should be superordinate, not subordinate to the left hemisphere, because it understands meaning. Okay. So my particular derivation of that is, I think there's a bigger problem, well, a more fundamental problem with language itself. So language itself, not so much language as an it, but more as a how. How we use language deeply affects how our attention operates.
Yes.
And I think to a certain extent, academics are less inclined perhaps to embrace such a statement because they intrinsically use language to be academics.
Yes.
I think they're a bit careful. They're a bit more careful around that idea than they might be. But I do think, for me, it's not particularly arguable that language carries. And the first language thing we learn is naming. And we learn that at some advancement from our birth. I mean, from a personal perspective, it's eons later. From birth to the day you first name something is like forever in personal time. I mean, we all remember how long childhood seemed to last. We got to the end. I mean, we were kind of wishing it was over by such a long time. But in that huge development of our first naming, that incredible milestone, and the glee and happiness of our parents at our first naming of something, usually one of them is, well, often one of them, I should say, is that's just, it's a pivotal moment, but it's not the first thing we learn. I think we spoke about this. I feel that perhaps the first thing we learn is music, our first exposure to human language. Well,
we did talk about that.
It's actually the song of music that we hear. We don't hear the actual language.
No, exactly. We hear the sort of murmurings of our mother's voice while we're submerged. which would
Indeed,
sound
we
like
do.
hummus. Yeah, yeah.
Indeed, exactly. So anyway, that's my potted history. I'm a little bit more fundamentalist, perhaps, than Ian McGilchrist, insofar as I see that language, in its way of doing things, smuggles a lot of things in prior to perception.
Mm.
And so some of the work, I think, of engaging with the world is, first of all, to accept your perceptions and to attend to them. And actually, what's incredibly astonishing about this, and anyone who's done mindfulness will understand what I'm talking about, is once you start paying attention, suddenly you start noticing things you weren't noticing before. Your life somehow becomes richer, more interesting. And then, I guess if you're embracing a particular view of the world that might involve your psychic involvement, I've repeated myself there, sorry, it might involve your psychic connection and influence over the world in ways which are not easily explained in what would be considered a rational way. If that's the territory into which you're accepting is possible, I think that is even more interesting than mindfulness. It's a type of mindfulness, if you like. Mindfulness is a variant of such engagement. And what's interesting is I think the universe talks to you. It speaks to you.
And it does. I agree with you totally.
Yes. And that is really an extension of what I was saying last time, insofar as we were talking about music. For me, music taught me the universe is trying to talk to me. It's trying to communicate with me. Songwriting was an experience in the universe, communicating with me, collaborating, me being part of that, actually. Not being responsible for it, as just being responsible for saying yes to it, I think, accepting it and allowing it to inspire me to become part of something bigger. I think that's basically where I'm standing at the moment. And since we spoke, I think it'd be safe to say that I'll be engaging in practice, which is about me attending to more than just the living world, more than just being mindful, but consciously embracing the idea of communication and listening a lot, listening to sensory experiences a lot, parking myself in a particular. I think this is where it gets interesting, actually, because I've been doing a little bit of reading and linking up into things and trying to. I don't know. I wouldn't say I've been researching. That'd be overblown. But I've been linking into material that might inspire me, just in the same way as I might read a book and then write a lyric. So I don't see it as any kind of formal. It's random, stochastic. Is that the right word? I'm just exploring, really, what is out there already and what other people are saying, how they feel about it. And I've run into some people who are really interesting to me, Gordon White at Rune Soup has my word, the man is prolific. That's one of the most prolific things I've seen. I couldn't believe it. But there's so much there. It's almost overwhelming until I think the penny dropped for me is that, right, this is a life. This is a window into somebody else's life. And of course it's rich. He's recording a lot of it, which is actually extremely useful. It's extremely useful. You're actually, even if something's 3 or 4 years old, you're on the voyage with them, experiencing in a way them experiencing something for the first time. It's really useful in that regard. And then I've done a little bit of poking around outside of that here and there. There's a lot of stuff that I find difficult to engage with. It's too certain, rule bound, rule governed. Alan Chapman has been useful. That was a link Rich sort of pointed me out ages ago. And then I've been back. Alan has a totally different angle, I'd say.
Yes, I would
to many other people.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about that to get involved in a deep discussion of him, but there were some moments where I'm just like, this is absolutely something I've already thought. There's a thought that he's just saying something. I had just such a moment the other day when I was thinking about language. What did I write? I actually wrote some notes down, just scribbling things. And I was thinking, language is kind of like Linnaean surgery. So this idea that it's a kind of surgical operation when you use language. And Linnaeus is the, guy came up with the idea of naming all the animals and plants, everything in the animal and plant kingdom and the fungi kingdom, naming everything with Latin names. That was Linnaeus. That was the original idea. And of course, that's now standard biology. But classification, basically. So Linnaean surgery was something that popped into my head as a kind of phrase that might encapsulate that. And Alan Chapman said something almost precisely. I think he called it vivisection, or language, human culture, and the way language works is a type of vivisection. I'll stop waffling.
Well, that is very much the type of thing that goes on with the left side of the brain.
Right.
It's sort of the editor, the thing that comes in and cuts and labels and classifies. Whereas, of course, the right side of the brain seems to make these sort of metaphorical connections between things, but doesn't necessarily. It sort of groups things together, but it doesn't sort of cut them down, and it sort of reverberates. This seems to be the thing that really sticks out. Now, you talk about naming, saying when a child names something, but of course, going into this, let's have a look at some of the mechanics of sort of magical thinking. Whether that's tarot cards or calling in a spirit. To find the name of something was the way that you controlled whatever it was, right? And if you think of that even in the logical world, if you know what something is and you can give it a name, you can communicate with somebody else about that thing because they know what that thing is,
right?
So the thing of naming, or the thing of creating a symbol that represents that thing, is obviously something and we know that as being a magical act anyway, because that's the thing, it's representing something with something else, so you can control it or modify it and so on.
Yeah.
So it's very essence of that is a sort of a magical function. Now, and of course within stories and myths and all the rest of it, whether it's I've been listening to Harry Potter stories again, right?
Sure.
On Audible with Stephen Fry reading it. And of course, the thing that this idea that you don't name Voldemort, and it's and you look at that from the point of view of the gods that cannot be named,
right?
So there is this thing about naming, right?
Yes.
Even I was thinking about the Game of Thrones thing, where I think it's Arya names, I can't remember his name now, but she names him, and he wants her to unname him.
Yes, I remember.
So we understand this thing about naming and what it does, and obviously going purely into sort of like magical ritual magic. Of course, naming a demon is the way that you can control and bind a spirit, right? So there is this sort of thing, and if you look at that, there's that reflection about what's going on within the mind, right? The right side wants to classify and cut down and put in a box and all the rest of it. But this other part of the brain doesn't do that. It gives the context and places things in. You can start to see that there's a link with that, and you can be one with all this stuff, right?
Yes.
But you don't even know, you after you come out of those experiences, you never know what it was. you never really can put your finger on what it was that was happening and what you experienced. And in the telling of it, it just doesn't sound right. So I think that really expresses something that goes on with the consciousness of these two.
Absolutely. And if that wasn't bad enough, here's the thing: they're both right.
Yes.
And neither of them are. They're neither and. It's a
Yes.
paradox. It's an intrinsic paradox buried, actually apparent in our consciousness.
Yes, exactly.
So how is this adaptive? How is this environmentally? If we're going to go back to the old school evolutionary just so story narrative, that we should expect any adaptation to provide us with an evolutionary advantage.
Well,
What's the
that's
advantage?
obviously not true, is it?
Okay,
but we think that. But that's the point, that we do think that, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
and
it's implicated in the theory.
Yeah. So all that really does is beg the question: what on earth is it for then? And of course, Ian McGilchrist very cleverly, and I think this is probably his original idea. I could be mistaken, but I think it's his original idea. He said it was really to do with predation. So the left hemisphere evolved. I'm not saying this is true, by the way.
No.
This is what he said.
Just go with that.
But I think it's a clever idea. Is the idea that we needed two types of attention foundationally. Yes. All organisms need this.
Yes.
They need two types of attention. One is for identifying food, so that we can separate it from its environment, pick it up, eat it, whatever. And the other type of attention is to prevent us being predated. So he's done a good job there, I think, of coming up with an original way of understanding why on earth we might have this type of attention. But I think it's even weirder than that, because one of those minds seems to be open to introspection and the other one not. And so that right hemisphere, we might call this the implicit self, seems to be incapable really of introspection in the same way as the left hemisphere is. And one might understand that as a function of language. So when we introspect into our thoughts, are we really engaging with our thoughts, all of them? Or are we really just engaging with language and how language parcels thoughts up into expressible notions? Difficult questions, and I don't propose answers to them. But certainly when I hear people talking about consciousness, and I'm talking about people who are vastly more intelligent than me, vastly more scholarly, who, it seems to me, confuse cognition with consciousness all the time. It seems to be there seems to be not enough breadth in their idea of consciousness, to me.
I agree with that.
And I think the difficulty here is, if you start talking about something you cannot introspect upon, or nobody can examine, that seems perhaps unscientific. How are you meant to measure it? And this is the difficulty with the paradigm, as Ian McGilchrist points out. I'm sorry I'm banging on about him a lot, but it's a very influential set of ideas. That the people confuse the map with the territory.
Yeah.
And I think this is, so in other words, the map says that there are no dragons there. And so dragons don't exist. It doesn't say dragons on the map, so they're on none. So we're confusing the map with the territory. The map is not an exclusive document.
No.
Like, document of the mind of the world around us is not exclusive. It is heuristic. And language is heuristic. And that's why I was saying it's like Linnaean surgery. You're cutting chunks off the world around you, you're simplifying it and rendering it into expressible parts, which of course has cultural power. That has cultural power, and which has community and collective power in terms of identifying needs and addressing them collectively. But the question is begged, is there another collective way of communicating? And I think this is where we get into the question of, does telepathy occur? I mean, most people I know have experiences of telepathy. I have a couple of direct experiences of telepathy.
Yes.
I certainly have experiences of communication coming from places I can't identify, that don't appear in any textbooks. So some of which is extremely subtle. And I think this is the thing. It's not human so much as it's not human language based. It seems to be in your direct experience. Well, of course, everything is in your direct experience. So the fact that other people cannot express those experiences in precisely the same way as you doesn't invalidate them being the same thing. So I'm sorry, I'm going around the houses a little bit here, just laying out a bit of ground. So forgive me, that was quite a long.
Let's go back into the thing about maps, because I do a lot of stuff about maps. When I teach people, you know, I often use the metaphor of maps to do with, you know, here's the terrain of music. So, right? But of course, if you change the musical style, the map changes. What you can do to connect up the dots, you know, travel from this idea to that idea.
Okay.
If you're playing jazz, it's different from if you're doing the same thing and you're playing, I don't know.
Okay.
Right. So and one of the points I've got to get at is that if you look at the idea of a map can be as simple as being, you know, a rough drawing of an island with a palm tree on it. You know, and there are X amount of steps from the palm tree, and that's where the treasure is buried. Type of treasure island type map. Right? To the type of maps that we have now. But the interesting thing about this is that obviously a lot of those maps involve some cultural relationship to the map. So if you had the Treasure Island map, you'd have to know where that island was and how you were going to be able to get there on your boat and all the rest of it before you made sense of the map. And that's exactly the same thing, you know, knowing how a map works if you look at an Ordnance Survey map.
Okay, yeah.
But one of the things I like to bring into the fact is that with medieval maps and stuff like that, they'll have these sort of things where there's dragons over here. We don't, you know, there may be dragons. And in actual fact, in the creative process, it's a good idea to have a part of the map that says there may be dragons here. You know, because we don't really know what happens over here.
Right.
Because again, what we've done is we've got this sort of thing of a false sense of certainty that we have with our way of thinking. And of course, language has done this for us because we want it to be exact. Unfortunately, language isn't exact, is it? You've only got to look at somebody's text message that they sent you and you can get completely the wrong end of the stick. You know. So we're going back to this sort of thing about what is language actually there for?
Right.
And you know, because you mentioned this thing about this evolutionary progress type of, I've put the word progress in, but there's this unsaid thing which we all sort of operate on, this idea that things are going to get better because we're evolving.
Right.
But of course, it's not that at all. It might be a fact that we're just adapting to something. Right. It doesn't mean to say that we're going to get better. It just means we're just adapting.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of stuff that disproves this idea that we improve. Language is a good one. Because if you look at some of the oldest stories ever written, they are far more complex, far deeper, with more layers of meaning than any story that's written now. So, you know, go to a Gilgamesh story or any sort of Upanishads or whatever, you've got layer upon layer of meaning to these stories. They could be telling you stuff about your deep sense of consciousness as well as what's possibly out there in the world that we don't understand. To, you know, a narrative that we could understand, you know, well, how did they manage to do that so long ago if things are improving? So this is the point where we can't seem to do that now.
Right.
You know, lots of ancient languages were poetic. Lots of tribal languages are poetic.
Yeah.
They're far more complex and layered with cultural meaning than
Mm-hmm.
our conversation, even though it's very deep to one another.
Right. Okay.
So, so there are lots of things that are evident that
Yes.
that play with this idea of evolution.
Yes.
But it doesn't quite happen in the way that we think it does. I'm not saying things don't change, because they do, but not necessarily in the way that we assume. And that assumption has come from language. Even the word evolution means that it's getting better. It's
Mm.
developing.
Mm.
To evolve.
Mm.
So
Yes.
on every level,
Mm-hmm.
we're wrestling with it, with language, aren't we?
I would agree with that. I would say certainly when we look into the past and we attend to history, that's all we have. You go far enough, that's all you have is what was written down. You might have some objet, might have some remains, and you'll have history. And we're much more certain when we read the history. Helps us to reconstruct, especially daily living records, help us to reconstruct the humanity of the people that lived before us. And when we consult I guess if we read the great texts of the past, the, I don't know, mysteries and legends, we find a lot of allegorical stuff in there, metaphorical things that may refer to stuff that we're struggling to understand. It becomes
Well,
quite
also,
clear.
we are out of context with that.
Mm.
You see, this is the problem, isn't it? And I mean, going back to this, because we haven't really spoken too much about magic, but we're still keep going around the fabric.
Right.
You cannot understand the medieval or the ancient mind without including magic.
Mm.
And when we say magic, we don't necessarily mean people waving wands around.
Right.
Suggesting that, but the fact that there is more in the world than we understand. So again, if you think about the Vikings, I mean, the Vikings obviously had some sort of connection with their gods, but they spent more time worrying about what the elves were going to be doing, because they were the nature spirits that they were having more problems with than anything else.
Right.
And that, I would have said, that would have been absolutely the same for any culture. They'd be more concerned about the jinn if you're in the Middle East or Pakistan, what is now Pakistan or India.
Okay.
And the fairy folk if you lived in Northern Europe.
Right. Okay.
Because they had more of a bearing on your life than things that, to be quite honest, couldn't have given a shit about you.
Right.
Because they have other things to deal with. But so you can't easily get back into that mindset without including some awareness, at least, of how people were dealing with the world they couldn't see.
Mm.
Well, they might have been able to see it, but you understand what I'm saying. The more than human world.
Mm.
And what we seem to have done, and that, again, appears to be the world of the right side of the brain. Right.
Right. Indeed.
Right.
Yeah, so that's an important point you're making there, Vic.
Yes, that is the point I'm getting at. And you can see where this is going because of the way that these languages and how we've then started to sort of, everything's being sort of lopsided onto this, the left side of the brain sort of thinking, where it's all very analytical. Right. Anything that we can't analyze and measure, because as soon as we put it into a scientific laboratory, or a lab, it doesn't exist and it doesn't function like that.
Right. This is the mystery, isn't it? You're describing the mystery, and I love that, Vic. I think what you're saying is bang on. And I don't see that enough, really, when I'm just sort of wandering around looking at what's out there. I don't hear this enough, that you have to be careful how you're approaching something, because how you approach something defines how you're attending. You can presuppose your attentional bias, can't you? So if I'm trying to make some sense out of something in order to render it explicit to another person via language, I have to attend to it in a particular way in order to do that. Rather than experiencing it it can start to affect how you're interacting because your intention is to explicitly render it. So we are in a bit of a pickle. We're in a bind, aren't we?
We are.
And I think that that speaks to a deeper mystery, which is worth wondering about. That's not necessarily getting to grips with it, labeling it and parceling it away.
Well, that's the point, because again, that trips us up into the thing that we don't want to happen. So
exactly. So you end up doing what you're repudiating.
This is why I keep banging
the
on
coincidence of opposites.
Yeah, this is why I keep banging on about the fact that it's not about answers, it's about better questions.
Right.
Because as soon as you answer something, you've already lost what it is that you should be wondering, and that seems to be, again, the dilemma.
Right.
It's almost like the question, the wondering and the posing of a question may be the doorway to the right side of the brain. But the answering of the question is shutting the door with the left side of the brain. Because as soon as you think, I know the answer to this, it's that, suddenly everything else is.
Well, so this is really interesting, Vic. Haven't you really the answer or the product of an equation? This is now ended. This operation is over, and here's the product.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine. So let me just rewind slightly. I'm not repudiating the use of language. I'm just saying it's largely unconscious use. It's an unmindful use is damaging to the richness of your experience. I would propose that that's probably the truth of it. And that we need both types of attention. We need both because both are part of the world we live in. And I could speculate wildly, and indeed I have, and probably will continue to speculate wildly about what's going on from a metaphysical and a physical perspective here. I love to think about those things. And again, I'll reference in our last conversation, I said, for me, a conversation is not an exercise in showing competence. It's actually getting to the edge of your competence and potentially risking falling off into something that just ends up gobbledygook, because that's much more interesting. And I think that willingness in me is something of a strength, although it probably isn't recognized as that. I don't get rewarded for doing it, I don't think, really. I think that's an unrewarding way in the modern world to operate. And I think that's a shame. We lose something through that. If you're a musician, however, there is a domain in which you can explore the limits of your competence, and that is rewarded. That is a rewarding thing to do. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so special. I think the implicit arts, and I don't mean to denigrate the other implicit arts either. It's just I know less of them. That's all. Music is, it's something that's been with me my whole life, and so I just know more. I feel more personally akin to that than I do the others. Greenwood spoon carving is another implicit art that I love, but I have a much more recent relationship with that. Right. Having said that, I'm disambiguating those two things from each other. I don't need to at some level. They're part of the same thing.
Yes.
They're all of a oneness. It's just that I experience them differently. But that's okay. I'm fine with that. I don't get confused. I can live with the neither and kind of arrangement there.
Yeah.
I think so. So it does occur to me that we could get into that side of it. I did wonder, though, Vic, because this is something I've run into because I've been explicitly wandering around the internet, like looking at things. And one of the first things that people talk about when they're engaging with magic is, let's have a pop at a definition of magic. So I was going to be cheeky and ask you a question.
Right.
And ask you, would you be willing to have a pop at the definition?
Right. So here's the problem, because again, we're using language.
Yes, quite.
Because I think that magic is far more common. You know, I think it's sort of infused in absolutely everything that goes on.
Right.
But we don't see it like that.
Yeah.
So this idea of affecting change by will and all this sort of idea, you know, I think, well, yeah, that's that. But it's almost like there's a mechanics behind it, and the way I see things happen. So we talk about the effects of magical thinking, whether that's, for instance, reading, let's say it's reading tarot cards as a you know, where you can read something that, and it could be really accurate.
Yeah.
But accurate, not in, oh, you know, your parcel's going to turn up 3:30 in the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
But there'll be something about the nature of the arrival of the thing that is really is there in you can see, right?
Yes.
And that seems to be something that mirrors itself across various things. For instance, I was involved very early on in spiritualism, and I trained in a circle, and used to do a lot of trance mediumship and stuff.
Okay.
And what I discovered very early on is that you can say what you see without trying to explain what it actually means. And it would be far more relevant to the person who you were telling it to than if you said, this means that.
Yeah.
And I see exactly the same thing with tarot cards. And I see exactly the same thing of any sort of, you know, some sort of oracle work, where you can read it as it is. In other words, you can tell a story about the thing. And the story will contain the stuff that needs to be transmitted. You're not answering the question in that way, but it seems to be tapping into that part of the brain that sort of sits under, you know, let's say the brain, the consciousness sits underneath things that make sense of stuff.
Yeah.
And it could have multiple meanings on multiple levels, like any sort of koan, you know, Buddhist thing, that this thing means this on this level and this on that level. And it's only recently started to sort of click. And it's not that I haven't thought like this before, but now I'm becoming more practiced at being able to see how that is.
Yes. Okay.
All right. So
makes perfect sense to me.
So the magical bit then, I would say, is talking far more about, I'm going to use that right side of the brain. To me, that's what magical, that's how we could talk about it.
Yes.
But it's actually to do with this sort of more integrated, being able to see the big picture and understanding how, if you pull on this part of the web, this part of the web is moving. You know,
brilliant.
When you see this bird over here, it might be a crow. It's every crow, right? As well as being a crow. You know what I mean? And that crow is symbolic to you of something, means something on a level.
Yes,
that's where I think I am with it.
Brilliant.
And obviously that's the same thing with musical creativity.
Yeah.
that you hear a sound, and that sound will immediately make you think of, I don't know, the Beatles or something, because
Right.
that is a sound that you recognize a melody or something like that. But
Mm.
it could also mean that it reminds you of the 1960s, or it reminds you of your
Right.
sister or mother
Oh,
or something.
yeah. Yeah.
Now, so that's the point, that it's not boxed in.
Mm.
So the working with that is, I would say, is my definition of magic.
Brilliant. I mean, I love that. So it's wondery. It's not definite. It's not definite. It's
No.
interactive and relational.
Yes.
And I am having to use language to communicate with you about this, and I'm trying to do that mindfully with a view to when we talk about definitions. That's an exercise in futility, of course, in one sense, but also there are things you can do with language, of course. Poets and lyricists do it all the time, where you subvert language to do something, to drop a seed into the mind of another.
Yes. Well, that is magic, isn't it? Yeah.
It's not a complete thing.
No.
It's a
No.
thing
Well,
that grows.
that is a very good point, because
Mm.
I do a lot of NLP stuff. That is the
Mm.
same principle, really,
Yeah.
with it, because it's like saying to somebody, dog. If you said dog to somebody,
Yeah.
they would choose a dog that they probably like. But if you said big dog, for some
Right.
people that could become not a very pleasant
Right.
idea.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. But you haven't sort of said what type of dog it is and why it should be. You haven't said ferocious dog or anything like that.
Right.
You
Yeah.
see, just subtle uses of words trigger. And from a point of view of hypnotic suggestion, that is, of course, what we're under all of the time with the use of language.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And again, that has its use that you would look at in certain circumstances and say, that's magic.
Yeah.
Or it's a song lyric.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, quite. So, like, you haven't got enough space in a song or a poem to write everything out like you would in a novel, and that
Yes.
compression, if it's done creatively and mindfully, it can be utterly amazing.
Yes. Because you just have to imply, don't you? You see, this is the thing. It's like I was saying about what we use when we ask a question, we open the door.
Mm-hmm.
We come up with the answer, we sort of shut it.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
this is, in actual fact, this happens with lyric writing, right? So I'll give you a
Yeah.
really good example of this without going on too long, because
Sure.
if I said to somebody, right, okay, you're going to write a protest song,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you'd end up with a load of old rubbish, basically. Because what people would do is they would put down on there what it is that they want to moan about.
Mm-hmm.
The great protest songs never did that.
Right.
They posed a question, or it was in some metaphor that everybody understood what it was.
Yes.
As you said, it's implicit, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not explicit.
Mm-hmm.
And great lyrics, great poetry, you imply the feeling, the emotion. You describe the situation that caused by the thing that you never said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
See, this is what I think is great with language. And I think this is what our forebears did when they wrote things like Gilgamesh.
Right.
Or the tales of Cthulhu or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
That's what they were doing. They were telling you something. They were implying. And this is the problem that we've had with the way that we've been dominated with this sort of analytical thinking.
Right.
We don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So performing surgery, if you perform surgery, I mean, Ian McGilchrist, again, sorry, boringly, makes this point very eloquently. He says, if you have to explain a joke to somebody, it's not a joke anymore. No. And I think this is it. You're planting a seed, and the point of the seed is that it unfolds and grows in the mind of another. and it does so in the way that that mirrors their capacity to do so.
Yes, in their environment.
Right. So, like, whatever emerges from that will be of the nature that you're communicating, but in a way that's personal to that individual.
Exactly.
Isn't that beautiful?
I do, yeah, it is, and completely, utterly natural, because I do, I do a lot of walking and I do a lot of foraging and stuff like that. Because once you get out and living where you do, you would know this. You find a hawthorn tree that's in a valley, and it would look completely and utterly different from the hawthorn tree that's sitting on the top of a hill.
Right. Which is probably all hawthorn tree
down here. Like very small, bending away from the wind and all the rest of it.
Right.
One in the valley would be sort of big and luscious and all the rest of it.
Right.
It's the same hawthorn.
Right. Right.
So that's the thing about thoughts.
Aspect hawthorn.
Yes. Yeah. And that is how that's how it should be with us. That any idea will grow in the environment that it's set in. In other words, somebody else's mind.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. And I was thinking, like, there are beautiful maneuvers one can perform with language. Beautiful. I'm not repudiating language. I love language. I love it. I think language is wonderful. It needs to be in a proper order. And I don't quite know how I can justify that statement. It needs to be properly ordered in terms of what its objectives are. If it sets its own objectives, unfortunately, it can be destructive. If it's only about classifying and naming and nailing everything down, and so that you can own it or consume it, I think it's not its proper use, or not. It's not a fabulous use for such a wonderful instrument.
No, exactly. That's not its primary use.
Right. I was thinking, wouldn't it be better with magic to define what it isn't?
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this for a few weeks now. Wouldn't it be better, rather than trying to define language, trying to define magic, trying to define what magic isn't? So I would say, from our conversation and from the thinking I've had over the last while since our last conversation, isn't it interesting to think that magic is not that which can be rendered explicit? If you can render it explicit, it's not magic anymore.
No, it becomes science.
Because it's already happened.
Yeah, but also you can explain why it happened.
It's already happened. Magic is what has not happened yet. So it's really interesting, the cultural variant of this notion is that the explicit self and the explicit culture to which we are daily devoted by default is interested in what is probable, not in what is possible.
Yes.
So I think this is there is the division, is probability and possibility. And I was talking to a friend about this the other day, and he rightly pointed out the possibility is really just a special state of probability, isn't it? You could express any possibility as a probability. The problem is that presupposes there is a fixed probability of a possibility. What if it's much more dynamic than that?
I think it's more dynamic than that.
Yeah.
Actually. Because so I think what happens with this is that as soon as we start thinking like that, there is like a set of parameters that are unchanging. Because we always do this when we try to nail something down.
Right.
We lose sight of this extraordinary flow of tides and stuff that are going on. Different things growing and dying and moving around and, blah, 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 in order to go do this and then this happens.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So again, if you look at that, that is a very left side scientific thing.
It is, isn't it?
We take all of this stuff out of the way, we stick it into a little thing. right?
Mm-hmm.
And cooking is a really good example of this, right?
Oh Lord, yeah.
We do this, and then this happens.
Yeah.
So, baking is the great example of this, right? So baking is science.
My nemesis, by the way,
Yeah,
baking.
so baking is science. So
Yeah.
we do this, we do that, and this happens.
Yeah.
Whereas cookery can be all sorts of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So, and I think it's interesting that actually magic is more like cookery.
Right.
And there's so many things, so many magical things that are involved in something that you could look at and think somebody is making something that's in a pot, right?
Right.
It's a stew or whatever. And if you look at lots of West Country magic, a lot of it is like that.
Right.
We stick the thing in a
I
pot.
know nothing West Country magic, Vic. Please enlighten me.
Well, the thing is, if you look at, I grew up in Cornwall, so I know there's a few bits and
Right.
things. But there's lots of things about things in pots that you stir. You get a bucket of water and you stir it and say something, and you can control, what's going to happen with the tides and all this sort of stuff. There's lots of weather magic that uses stirring. And one of the great ones is war water. Have you come up with this one?
What?
War water.
Did you say war?
Yeah, war, as in warfare, water.
War water. No, never
War
heard of
water.
it.
So you get a pan and you stick a load of nails in it and you boil them up, and of course the water then becomes red.
Of course. Okay.
And then you can do all this stuff with this water, like inflict damage on people.
Ah,
But you're doing this while you're stirring it.
right. By the pricking of my thumbs. Yeah, pricking your thumb with an iron, with a nail.
Yeah, but you're not pricking your thumbs with these.
No.
But it's the same idea, right? So it's the use of iron.
Yeah.
Right. So there's an alchemy in it, but there's also the fact that you're boiling water and you're using heat.
Interesting.
And you're stirring something. Okay, this is always a good one, isn't it? Stirring something.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, but if you look at that, you think, well, there's something about this sort of intentional use of elements, heat, water,
Right.
activity, thought. Not quite sure how we got onto this one, but this stuff was done by ordinary people.
Yes.
Who had to fix things very quickly with whatever they had.
Right.
And whatever seemed to be the way to go.
Yes.
Probably never had a book to refer to.
Well, quite.
It was probably something that was done by their grandmother that they saw them do.
Right.
Right.
And they probably didn't do it exactly, didn't do it precisely as their grandmother did.
No, of course they didn't, because you don't need to. So this is the point about this. Is this idea that we want to make something happen in a particular way, so we have to follow the instructions.
Right.
But I don't think it's done. It's like that. It's like saying, well, if you want to grow this tree over here, what do you need? Well, you certainly need the seed, and you certainly put it to go into a bit of ground that is the type of ground that this tree needs. Then what? Not very much more, really. Okay. As long as there's plenty of, there's enough water, but not too much, and plenty of sunlight, but not too much, then it'll probably do it itself.
Absolutely.
But you see, if you bought a book on horticulture, it would be a darn sight more complicated than that.
I love this idea of cookery as being magical process. And of course, this links back to something I think you casually said some like 20 minutes ago, which is that once you embrace the idea of possibility, and you embrace the notion that such non-materialistic, possibly inexpressible interactions are really happening, your basic presumption would have to be that it's universal, right? And so your analogy isn't so much an analogy as a statement of the bleeding obvious, that when you're cooking something or performing a magical act is not then all imbued with magic. Alan Chapman said this. I was watching a video of his the other day, and he said something like, if you think you're a great practitioner, then you think far too little of yourself. I'm like, there is a humility there that I can not only appreciate but resonate with. Is that there's a sense of this great mystery. This is kind of what I was trying to drive at the beginning, is that I could sit here and be ever so humble and say something like, I don't know anything about magic. I think that's true, actually. It doesn't mean we can't talk about it. In a way, it's like, no, it depends what you mean by knowing.
Yes.
It depends what you mean. Do I know how to cook a dal? Yes, I cooked an absolutely blinding one last night. And is it magic? Too right, it is. Wonderful. Love it. But it's also an evolving, living thing that I acquired, and I don't have this defensiveness about cultural misappropriate or appropriate.
No, because that's another one, isn't it? Come on. We've always appropriated other culture stuff, right?
The most bizarre. It's the most bizarre application.
Then why have we got to this point now that we suddenly decide that this is not a good thing to do? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, if you're like me and you grew up somewhere that doesn't exist anymore, you're kind of a bit screwed, really, if you're going to do anything. And what am I going to do? What am I going to do?
Look, it's a classic one. Look,
everything appropriated for me. Literally everything. Everything I'm wearing.
I mean, look, here's a good one. Angels, right?
Right.
Okay. So where do they come from? Well, probably from Babylon or Sumeria, right? These are the first sort of objects that you look at and go, well, these look like angels. They're winged creatures and all the rest of it. So when does that arrive in the Jewish pantheon? Well, after they spent a lot of time in Babylon, basically. So if that's not cultural appropriation, if that's not cultural appropriation, and then when do they appear in Christianity? Well, when we start to take on board all the extra stuff that we're, so you look at that and you go, okay.
Yes.
So we've always been doing it. We've always appropriated other people's words, other cultures' style of cooking, other cultures' gods and all the rest of it. We've done it all the time. That's exactly what we've always ever done. So, how do we all end up with chords in music, that were only in the West? Well, they've been appropriated by other people. So,
Yes. And I love stories, I love why the raven or the magpie might be a magical creature. I love this. Of course, Wales is absolutely imbued with a mythology, which I'm a very poor scholar of, but I'm improving. I'm engaging with that now. Slightly Gordon White's urging, really, that I should start to think about things locally.
You're really definitely you should do, because again, that has to do with your environment, your person. Right.
This is the immediate world. You're living in the immediate world. Why would I reach across? I mean, there's no reason I shouldn't. Personally, for reasons I've just explained, have no qualms about cultural appropriation.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a little story because we're going to have to stop shortly, and then because we'll have to get into the mechanics of magic next. I think we're going to have to do that. All right.
You reckon, like in a separate
session? I think we're going to have to do that. Yes. Right. We'll talk about, I don't know, whatever. But before we go, when I was about 7 or 8,
no,
I might have been a little bit older than that, maybe, but certainly before I moved away from Bournemouth, I had one. When you get these sort of well, I was going to say Technicolor dreams type of thing, panoramic. Epic dreams. I had one when I was very young, and it involved a Hindu god, right, who was blue, and this thing about Shiva was in this dream. Now, I was too young to know this stuff. My mother didn't have any books on Hindu, so it was incredibly, the actual dream was so meaningful after the event.
Yes.
So where's the cultural appropriation there? This just popped up out of nowhere, seemingly, because I didn't know anything about Hinduism.
Yes.
I certainly didn't have the, didn't know anything about Shiva.
How beautiful.
It was incredible. It was an incredible dream. But the
Wow.
point is that where did that come from? I don't know. Now, you could
Well,
go, well, see something.
our surprise at such a thing might be based, and I speculate wildly, I warn you, might be based upon an assumption that time is linear. Whereas, of course, this is one of the major things that would seem to be obvious to me, is that, well, that's true in one sense. If I'm
Yes.
with labeled explicitly separable parts, then time is linear. When I'm not doing that, it isn't. And am I one or the other? Well, I'm both and neither.
Exactly.
Or I'm neither and.
Exactly.
It's a very strange, and I think the difficulty here is that we're dealing with we're dealing with conflictual epistemologies, and isn't that fantastic that we're doing that?
Yes.
We're in this position of incredible privilege. It seems to me, it can be seen as burdensome, I think, and it can be frightening, but also it's immensely liberating and wonderful, and it has beauty. It has beauty in it, has all of the beauty that you've just described by relating an ancient story from your own life. And the way I see that, the childhood is ancient history. It went on for so long. It went on for eons. My childhood. Do you know what I mean? It went on.
Yeah, I know. And you think about, used to watch Blue Peter.
Right.
And they used to do their Advent crown thing, right?
Yeah.
Light the candle. And it then seemed to be an age before Christmas arrived. But of course, they were lighting this thing like 4 episodes before Christmas. And they were on twice a week, weren't they?
Right.
So, well, it was only a couple of weeks, but it seemed like forever before Christmas.
I actually have the experience very often of boiling a kettle or boiling an egg or something, usually to do with cooking. When I go, when I did this as a kid, it took like half.
Yes.
And now I'm in my 50s. It takes like literally 2 minutes. And I think 2 minutes is nothing. I'm like, 2 minutes is everything. There's another part of me that knows quite the opposite of this. It is extraordinarily strange, I think. We're dealing something. If I had anything to say about this whole arena, is that it's an extraordinarily strange and deep mystery, and it would be deeply arrogant of me to suggest for a moment that I fully understand it. I don't think it's there to be understood. It's there to be related to. If I have anything sensible to say, it's to be related to. Your relations are primary to the objects. This is what I'm extracting from both music and from Ian McGilchrist, is that relations are primary to objects or things, if that makes sense. And so I think that's, if I had to try and parcel this conversation up from my perspective, is that's where I am today, is I'm thinking about the relations within the cosmos, the world, particularly as they present immediately as the primary thing that I'm interested in. And the things are secondary, the things are important. And they can be encapsulated, as you suggested earlier, for example, it's not just this crow, it's all crows. You're being presented with opportunities to relate by using iconic or icons, or it doesn't really matter really. At the end of the day, you can interact with them in those ways. I think it's incredibly enlightening to do that. So what I am repudiating, it may not be obvious. I was just with this one corollary, is that I am disfavoring belief. I think that's where I'm coming from. Is in doing so, in operating in this way, I'm repudiating belief as a way of engagement, not faith.
No. I get what you mean.
Not optimism, but belief. And someone asked me, damn fine question the other day. Well, aren't you just playing semantics? He proposed, and I thought, aren't you just saying, just labeling things in a particular way is to move furniture around? But I think belief for me is an idea that has downstream consequences that you're not going to consider. If I had to say, it's a more holistic. A belief is something that you adopt an initial idea for which there are downstream consequences which you are not going to examine. It's something like that anyway, and that's as good as I can get, shooting from the hip using language, but that kind of feeling. So I'm really much more interested in what is really happening and learning, perhaps learning again to attend, because I do think that the experience of childhood should teach you, if it's accessible to you in any kind of way, should teach you that you already did this. That you've already been engaging with the world in that way.
Yes.
Child in the explicit world has a lot to learn, and the implicit world is already there. It's a lot of our cultural baggage and language baggage that gets in the way of that. What is already happening, really. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Brilliant.
All right, we'll pick up this.
Yes.
And we'll get into the
into the nitty-gritty.
To the nitty-gritty. That's brilliant stuff.
I really enjoyed that, Vic. That's fantastic.
Paul, it's fantastically stimulating conversation. So
yeah,
we'll catch up soon.
Okay.
And if I don't speak to you before, I can see you've got the tree in the background.
Yeah, look, not my fault. This is here. I must give credit where it's due. It wasn't me that put that up.
Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah.
All right then, mate. I'll speak to you soon.
All the best.
Don't disappear.
I shan't. Thank you.